time for one more, general book conversation. So how should we highlight or talk about works? So books here that are dated. Perhaps they contain things that we now, rightfully call problematic or just outdated. How do we talk about those things, or do we just remove those books? What do you do with those texts?
I would say there are two layers. One is if information in that book has been found to be non-factual, so it's full of things that have been proven not to be true, you would pull that book because you don't want misinformation. If it's not a matter of fact versus non-fact, libraries also all have weeding policies. We have our collection development policy, how we bring the books in and how we bring them out. So often what you'll find is that these dated materials aren't circulating. People aren't reading them anymore. So if I look at a book on the shelf and nobody has checked it out in 7 years, it's time for that book to move because we only have so much shelf space. So I don't think I would take a book out just because it feels dated, but if it's not earning its space on the shelf, it's time for the book to be withdrawn.
I loved all of Beverly Cleary's books, and I loved them to death. And I started to read them to my sons, and mom was in an apron, and mom didn't work, and mom didn't do any of those things, and we had to wait till dad came home to make a decision. And it was an interesting conversation that we had about, what is great about this book, what do we love about this book, and what is different today in our house.
Yeah, I think that is just the most important thing is, and I know it's my educator heart coming out here, but there is something to be learned from this. And we are trying to have an educated electorate. Meanwhile, our education system is, in some ways, it's like a wheel going the opposite direction of capitalism. Like the point of education is not to promote any specific idea or product or anything like that. It's to explore, to have conversations, to debate, to work these things out, and maybe come to a consensus of some kind, if possible. So I think the best and highest use of those books really is as learning materials, carefully selected by somebody who can help people learn why it's no longer acceptable. If they don't, maybe it needs to be said that, like, not all women wear an apron and work at home anymore. And it might seem obvious to you, but it might not be obvious to somebody else. So I think they do have an important role. And personally, I have collected a bunch of books that are just somewhat offensive. And I'm personally just very curious, like, what role do these books have in our society? And I haven't worked the answer out to this yet, but I am ruminating on it and I think about it often. And I think it's exciting. I think we have a longer line behind us of written materials that we can, and other types of storytelling. Like it's just the possibilities are endless, but I think there's something to be learned from it. And I think it's really important that we don't lose that thread of teaching why that thing is no longer acceptable and explaining to people like, and again, my lens is for children because that's who I worked with. But I had many successful debates I taught a class on Islam, and we talked about terrorism and talked about different events. I anonymized them and I was like, is this terrorism or is it not? And it turns out it's not easy to answer those questions. You've got to look at all of the historical context and what role that played in the bigger picture.